Hey, Pastor Kenneth here, and welcome to What About the Bible? In previous sessions, we've learned that the Bible is 66 books divided into two major sections, the New Testament and the Old Testament. Today we're talking about the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the ancient Jewish scriptures written a long time ago from 1500 BCE to 450 BCE. That means that the oldest writings in the Bible are around 3,500 years old. It was written by all kinds of people from all different walks of life. The primary language of the Old Testament is Hebrew, with a few bits of Aramaic. So how did these ancient writings get to us today? According to Jewish tradition, around 450 BCE, Ezra, who was a scribe and a priest, compiled the first collection of ancient Jewish writings. Now these texts already existed. He was just the first to put them all together in a collection. So by the time of Jesus, all of the Old Testament had already been written. And we actually have two collections of Jewish literature by the time of Jesus. Around 300 BCE, the primary language that the world spoke was Greek. Even for many Jews, their main language was also Greek. So they took the ancient Hebrew text and translated them into the Greek text known as the Septuagint. Septuagint literally means 70 because there was 70 or 72 people that translated the Hebrew text into Greek. And this Greek translation, known as the Septuagint, allowed the world to read the Old Testament scriptures. In fact, when you read the New Testament and they're quoting something from the Old Testament, usually they're quoting from the Septuagint Greek translation rather than the original Hebrew text. So around 300 BCE, we have two different texts in circulation, the original Hebrew and the Greek translation, the Septuagint. Now this was before the printing press, so it was very hard to make a copy of something. So they painstakingly copied it letter by letter, making sure no mistakes were made. Fast forwarding a few hundred years to the early Christian church, Christianity was growing rapidly, and the primary translation that those Christians used was the Greek Septuagint rather than the Hebrew scripture. Now, most of the first century Christians were actually Jews that had converted to Christianity, and some even considered Christianity just a sect of Judaism. So the Jewish people wanted to separate themselves as much as possible from this growing sect of Christianity. So around 100 CE, the Jewish people decided to move away from the Greek Septuagint in order to distance themselves from Christianity and primarily use the Hebrew scripture. At this time, they canonized the Old Testament, meaning they decided exactly which writings were scripture and belonged in the Old Testament. And this same collection that the Jewish people decided in 100 AD is our Old Testament that we use as Christians in the Bible. Now from 500 to 900 Common Era, there was a group of Jewish scribes and scholars known as the Masoretes. And they created a foolproof system of copying the Old Testament letter by letter without making any mistakes. The Masoretic System of copying was so precise that they could guarantee that the new copy was exactly what the old copy was, letter by letter. In fact, that's how they copied it, letter by letter, not word by word. If you or I were copying something, we might take a few words and then copy those down and read a few more words and copy those down. No, they did it letter by letter. So they looked at the old manuscript and said A, and went over and wrote an A. And they went to the next letter and wrote B, and so on and so forth, to where not even one letter was changed in a whole manuscript. When they were completed with the manuscript, they counted the number of letters to verify that nothing had been changed. It was a foolproof way of making sure that a new copy was just as good as the older copy. And if a copy was found to have any mistakes, the Masoretes had a practice of burning or burying any copies that had mistakes in them. Now, the oldest Masorete manuscript we have is the Aleppo Codex from around the 9th century. And all of the copies of the Old Testament we have today are based on this copy. And we can verify that there hasn't been changes over those last 1,200 years because we can compare modern Hebrew copies with that copy and see that no changes have been made. So we know for sure over the last 1,200 years or so that nothing has changed in the ancient Hebrew scriptures. But wait a minute, the oldest text we have is about 1,200 years old, but the Old Testament was written 3,500 to 2,500 years ago? That means there's at least 1,200 years between the time it was written and that codex from the 9th century. Couldn't there have been changes made in that time? Now, this is one of the most common objections to the Bible, that over the centuries it's changed little by little, kind of like the telephone game, so that when you get to the end, it's completely different than what you started with. So how do we know it wasn't changed? Well, first, remember the Greek Septuagint? We can compare the Greek Septuagint translation with the Hebrew text and see that they line up. But it gets better than that. In 1947, a major discovery was made: the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 11 caves, 981 different texts were discovered in Qumran, an ancient settlement about 1.2 miles from the Dead Sea. Archaeologists discovered coins dating from 135 years BCE to 73 years CE with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Radiocarbon and paleographic dating methods confirm the dates of these Dead Sea Scrolls to be at that time. These caves were filled with all kinds of texts, including, you guessed it, the Old Testament. So we can compare the Dead Sea Scrolls that date over 100 years BCE with the Masoretic text of 1,000 years later and see how much change really takes place. This is a test to see if that telephone game theory really holds up. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text were 95% identical. Identical. Identical means word for word with no changes whatsoever. So what about that other 5% that wasn't identical? These were misspellings that were made either in the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Masoretic text, or the sentence structure where the words were put in different order, but the sentence meaning remained the same. So in other words, there were only minor changes made that didn't affect the meaning at all. Thanks to the Greek Septuagint, the Masoretic text, and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can confirm that the Hebrew scriptures we have today are the same as the ancient scriptures written before the time of Christ. But what do you think? Have you ever wondered if the Bible's changed over the centuries? Have you ever heard someone say, hey, the Bible's changed just like the telephone game? And do you think there's any validity that the Old Testament has changed? After watching this video, are you more or less confident that God has preserved His Word throughout time? I want to know, and I'll see you in the next session of What About the Bible?